One of your most iconic projects was the 2019 interactive installation known as the Privilege of Escape, which was a public escape room where groups of players try to solve complex puzzles and tasks before the time ran out. Competing groups were separated into Group A and Group B, and they were asked to complete the same exact task, but the task on one hand, or on one side, was including a game-changing limitation that made it so much more difficult for that puzzle to be solved. And I absolutely love this idea, and I'm sure so many people who participated in this installation left with like a really important nugget of like insight and self-reflection. But I want to know, what did you learn about privilege or inequality after watching and creating this thing and seeing 3,000 people go through this escape room? Did any of the results surprise you, or did this thing sort of play out exactly as you expected?
Both. Like in some ways, the assumptions that I made and all the people who helped make it made, in some ways, those things played out exactly as we wanted them to, maybe even better than we had hoped for. And in some ways, there were really surprising things. In terms of what I learned things every step of the way, like even in making it, right? Like I knew when I started, I wanted to make an escape room that was a sort of experiential metaphor that helped people talk about privilege, because I saw and still see people like online, for example, arguing about privilege and like sort of conflating social privilege and economic privilege, which are extremely linked, but actually mechanically pretty different. And so thinking about that. And so one of the things, I guess part of the learning was distilling how do I want to tackle this, right, in this project? Like, what are the things I want to say about privilege? What are the questions I want to ask and get people to ask themselves? And so part of it was setting, like leaning into the myth of the meritocracy, which escape rooms do really well, and then crushing it because that's how it is in real life, and also that's I think that's a big emotional like turning point in the game. And then I think it was also a big part was to highlight the invisibility of privilege for those who have it, because again, like when I started the project, I had to figure out where are the places where people are disagreeing, what are people not understanding, right? People
Mm-hmm.
are like, oh, like, well, I had this disadvantage and I had this disadvantage. Like, people are usually aware of their disadvantages. They're not often aware of their privileges, right?
Mm-hmm.
And especially with social privilege, because the way I define it is having the like quote unquote normal experience when other people have structural oppression or structural disadvantage, right? So
Mm-hmm.
so the privileged group in my game, in my installation, had a normal experience. They had like a well like room conditions that lent themselves well to the exercises that they had to solve, and the other group had room conditions that made it like near impossible to do it, but they had the exact same tasks, right? And so in terms of how people understood the project, I think, I mean, the thing that I was just so grateful for was how well they did understand what the point was, right? And how there's something about going at the same time. Like, we would prioritize splitting up people who came together. So it's like, if you finish first, you'd be watching live CCTV footage of like somebody you know in the other room, like struggling. And it was really interesting to hear. These were the things that were unexpected and exciting. I mean, exciting in a this is mimicking shitty life kind of way. But like, there would be people who'd be like, oh my God, like, wait, is there like room, what's wrong with the room? And somebody's like, no, 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 that's just the camera. That's just the camera. Like, our room wasn't like that, even though you could see on the camera the structural disadvantage. And so, which I guess I'll just spoil because it makes it hard to like tiptoe around. Basically, one room had perfect lighting, right? And there were a lot of exercises that were based on coordinating colors, right?
Mm-hmm.
And matching colors. And the other room had red lighting, which made it impossible to tell the difference between certain colors. And so not only was it hard to complete the tasks, it was hard to even know what the task was, because when you see matching colors, you're like, oh, these two things must go together. When you don't see them, you have no idea what thing is related to what thing, right? And so anyway, so they're watching and they're like, is the room dark? And it's like, no, look, the walls are pink. Like, that must be the camera. Like, it's just not calibrated right. Like, our walls weren't pink. But like, if you had looked under the crack under the door, you'd see the red light coming through, right? But it's this thing that people will tell themselves lots of things in order to protect their privilege. It's like, and you see that whether it's with white people or even with like, the AAPI community, right? It's like, it's the things we tell ourselves to preserve our belief in meritocracy, our belief in our ability that we are doing well, that we did well, that we earned it, and there were other things. So there were people like who would say things, oh, this was shocking to me. People would be like, oh my God, we should boo them when they come out. Yeah, let's boo them. And I was like, wow, like that's intense, especially because they know that the project is called The Privilege of Escape. But it's just people, whether it's games or in real life, like when people are going for their goal, right? And there's something that they feel good about, they feel like they did it, they feel like they accomplished it. It's like, it brings out that like sort of like killer instinct, right? And compassion goes way down, right? And so then when they came out, we, set up some context talking about the history of games and things like that. And then we asked them, because we had a actor dressed as a research analyst, right? Asking them questions, because this whole thing's an immersive experience. So they feel like they're participants in a psychological study. Like, we don't use the word games. We don't use the word puzzles. It's all like study, test groups, exercises, tasks. And so we're doing like a feedback portion where we ask them about their conditions in the room. And that's when room A, the privileged room, finds out about the conditions in room B, right? And oh, by the way, we gave the people who finished first candy. So at this point, room A is literally eating candy that probably starts tasting bittersweet at that point, which is an interesting thing, because for me, the candy is a metaphor for economic privilege, right? Because like technically group B can get it, right? If they are able to bootstrap or whatever and get like past all of the structural disadvantage, right? But like most often you get the candy if you're in room A, right? And so while that's economic privilege and the lighting conditions are social privilege, they are extremely linked, right? And then it becomes a question of, well, are you willing to share your candy? Which I think relates to the conversation about reparations. People sometimes would ask things like, well, what happens if someone who is colorblind plays in the room with the full spectrum light, right? And for me, I liken that to being a quote unquote model minority, right? Like, while I may not technically be able to see the colors by association, I often get the candy. Or what if somebody is colorblind in room B? And I'm like, it depends. If they're the same kind of colorblind that we've essentially put on the whole group, then they tend to do better than usual because they're used to dealing with that type of adversity. It's like that resilience that you build up, right? But if they're a different kind of colorblind, like they're just completely fucked. And it speaks to intersectionality and how oppressions compound. And so these were all the things that people could talk about because of the game. Like, there were ways to talk about like the difference between social advantage and privilege, right? And like but ultimately it's like what I was going for was the emotions, right? Like the emotions of what it feels like if you're room B and you come out, you feel like shit, right? Like you feel like such a loser. And then you find out about the unfair conditions. And a lot of people expressed feeling like validated. They're like, 95% wasn't so bad considering, like, why didn't you guys get out sooner? Or being like, yeah, we would have crushed that, or being angry, right? Which was, I had to think about like, how do I want people to feel, especially marginalized people going through this, right? Like, I didn't want to like re-traumatize people. I wanted people to feel seen, and I wanted them to have a way to be like, yeah, look, like this is what I'm talking about, and in terms of the people who go through room A and have and find out about the conditions, most of them said things like they felt, guilty, but lucky. Like wouldn't, um, they wouldn't, they felt bad that the other room had to play in those conditions, but they wouldn't want to trade places with them, which I thought was really honest. And that was something I was curious about, and pleased that people were earnestly expressing how they felt. Like that was the part that I hoped for. I had hoped that people would be able to share their real feelings, and that was a relief and something I was really excited about, because I think that was the crux of the project. I think that's what like having to like sit across the room from the other people, and like you don't get to experience both sides, so you rely on listening to what people say and believing them when they describe the experience, which I think is something important in life too, right? And it's, I mean, other random things, I mean, I could tell a million stories about the project, but one thing, this was unusual, but it happened like more than once, less than 5 times more than once, but something that I found really interesting was it was usually, they all coded as male, the people that would say this, and most of them were white. Honestly, I think there was one who looked Asian, right? But they would be people who had played in room A with the full spectrum light, and they would ask, they'd be like, well, how much disadvantage does the red light cause? Like, can you quantify it in minutes? And like, had I been in the room at the time, because I'm in the control room, like listening with my headphones, and like, had I been in the room, I would have been like, well, how much disadvantage are you okay with? Right? Like, what's the over under on like acceptable amount of unfair to you? Right. And it was just such a strange question, but and the need, it like was rooted in this sort of disbelief of how bad it is. So there was that, especially because, like I said, along the lines of social identity and who asked. Another thing that was interesting was in room A, and there would often be a white woman who would say, like we would ask, how did you feel when you first entered this room and realized that you had finished faster than group B? And they would often say, well, like I was wondering what the catch was. I thought something was up. And so I asked the facilitators, the actors, to start writing down what people were saying and like reading it back to them. So at that moment, they'd be like, I heard you say when you got in the room, ha ha ha, we should boo them when they come out. My fiance is going to be so mad. Like, and just like hold up the receipts, right? Instead of being like, because it's like, that's the thing, right? It's like, and like I said, it was so interesting how many of these comments and the dynamic in the rooms themselves lined up with like what you read, what you know, what you experience about social privilege in the real world. Like, who were the people comfortable saying to other people, like when somebody be like, oh, maybe we should do this, and somebody's like, no, that's not right. Like, who's comfortable saying no? Who's comfortable asserting themselves? Like, all of this like fell like along race and gender lines. It was remarkable, I guess, or completely expected, either way, right? Somewhere like kind of both. And like, in fact, I even snuck into a game on the last day, just because I was curious. I snuck in. I played in room B because I was like, yes, I memorized all these things. I know all the answers, but I can't see like the colors, right? So let's just see what it is. I'll like hang back. And it was a really weird dynamic because it was like 7 Asian women and 2 white men. And one of the white men was really nice. One of the white men was a total douchebag. And the whole time he just kept shutting me down, even though like I know all the answers. And I was like, so what if we do this, like trying to help them, because I didn't want people to be like, oh, that was the artist, she like threw our game. So I was like earnestly trying to like give them hints, which I had written all the hints that go on the like monitors, but I was like trying to like do that ahead of time. And the guy kept being like, no, we don't need that. And I'm like, what do you mean you don't need that? I'm like, okay, so like, what's your plan? He's like, I don't know, but we don't need that. And like the part that was infuriating was like the Asian women in the room were following him, even though, like, and I mean, it got to the point where like I started sweating. I was so angry, and I like thought about it later. I'm like, why am I so angry? This happens to me like all the time. This shouldn't be surprising. But it's like the problem is I had had the privilege of like, I mean, the ultimate privilege, right? Because I had been in the control room, been the one like, like writing the hints. I had this like sort of, I don't know, it was like God privilege, right? It's like, because I was like the architect of like oppression. I was like, I was as the person who made it, right? And the ultimate authority on the project. So all of a sudden to play myself, instead of the person behind the scenes with the puppeteer and stuff like that, right? It was like, oh my God, like I don't usually have such a clear one-to-one on that. Usually it's like in real life, if somebody questions me, then I question myself. I'm like, oh, like, maybe this isn't the right way to do it, but I'm like, I'm 100% sure this is the right way to do it. And there's literally no other way. And it's the only time in life where I've known that so clearly. So yeah, it's, there were things like that were like super surprising. So it was like a mix. It was a mix of, making hypotheses and hoping that they panned out, being excited that they did, but then also just sort of being fascinated by all the nuances of how these things played out and the discussions. It was another thing that was surprising that was we would sometimes like close up at the end of the night and we'd still see the people from the last game upstairs like talking about it, and there's a group of strangers, but they're like still talking about the project and still talking about, and like I like ran into so I just opened a project in October in Ireland at the Science Gallery Dublin, and there was somebody at the opening who had apparently played The Privilege of Escape. And he apparently told the curator, he was like, yeah, this project reminds me of this like escape room thing I did in New York a few years ago, which like he didn't know my name, like it was like pretty amazing. And so when I talked to him, he told me like he didn't remember the details of the project, he didn't remember anything about the red light, but he remembered all of those emotional moments because he was in room B and he remembers being so mad about the candy. He remembers like having like this like sort of heated discussion at a bar afterward about privilege because he had like a white male friend in room A who didn't believe that the disadvantage was that big, and those are the things to me. I mean, that's why I do this, right? Like that's the whole reason why I made the project. And to find out years later that like not only did that happen, that this person remembers that is like to date probably the most validating thing I've heard in terms of feedback as an artist. And it just happened.
Wow. I mean, it just like it must have been this surreal experience, especially you talking about that last day of going in and realizing like the fact that you had designed this thing and the fact that like you're experiencing and like the the sort of experiment, the project worked on you and you're living through and feeling those feelings that you wanted other people to feel, almost as sort of like a replication of real world structures of what it's like in the corporate world, of what it's like being in like academics and having those people who are, they recognize that they have this privilege and yet they know that the conditions are unfair, but they're always just trying to find ways to justify and continue that.